At first glance, this video has kind of a strange title. Is the 8th best-selling game of all time worth playing? The instinctive answer is, well, yeah, obviously. But the question here isn't whether Skyrim has ever been worth playing. Sure, that would be a fairly idiotic question at this point. The question is whether it's still worth playing today, which is actually a very different question given that this game is now well over a decade old. And what was once considered groundbreaking in 2011 isn't necessarily going to give that same level of experience today. The world has moved on, our expectations have shifted, and the fact that Skyrim was once considered great doesn't necessarily help a new player to understand whether it's still worth their time today. And yes, believe it or not, outside of the RPG echo chamber that we inhabit, there are still plenty of people who have never played Skyrim. And there are also plenty of people who have the game sat in their Steam library, having only ever opened it for a few hours at most. How do I know this? Well, because Steam tells me through achievements. I can see from a simple glance at Steam that less than 50% of people who own Skyrim Special Edition have even cleared Bleak Falls Barrow, which is a very early requirement for the main quest. And even if you go back to the original version of Skyrim, you can see that while 75% of people have this achievement, less than 50% of people who own this original version of the game have completed Diplomatic Immunity, which is roughly halfway through the main story. So the majority of people who own Skyrim for PC haven't even completed half of the main story. Anyway, if you're watching this video, you might well be one of these people, with Skyrim still sat in the back of your mind as a game that you've always planned to play, one day. And if so, the title of this video is quite possibly the exact question on your mind. So let's go about answering that question. Oh, and for those of you watching who have played for hundreds of hours but for some reason still ravenously consume this content, like the Dovahkiin devouring a dragon soul, well, perhaps you could take the time to share your experiences with Skyrim too in the comments down below. Anyway, let's start our review as we always do with a brief bit of background. Skyrim is the 5th entry into the Elder Scrolls series, and it released in 2011 to pretty much universal adoration from both critics and fans. The game boasts a critic score of 96 on Metacritic, as well as a 94% all-time positive rating on Steam. Now, that's not to say that the game didn't also receive valid criticisms, but clearly the main takeaway is that the game landed immensely well. The game was of course published by Bethesda, who were just on fire for pretty much an entire decade. From the release of Morrowind in 2002, through Oblivion, Fallout 3, New Vegas, and eventually Skyrim in 2011. Sure, they put out some pretty rubbish games during that period as well, but 5 top-shelf RPGs in a 10-year period surely has to be considered the glory years for Bethesda. They poured everything they'd learned from the previous 2 smash hits in the Elder Scrolls series into Skyrim, and out of that process was born a game so successful that it must have exceeded the studio's wildest dreams. It was effectively a cultural phenomenon, managing to capture the attention of the mainstream gaming audience, who until this point had little to no interest in fantasy RPGs. I'm talking about people who had never played anything outside of sports games and first-person shooters, many of whom scoffed at the idea of engaging in what were largely still considered games for nerds. I genuinely remember some of the people who had scoffed at the idea of playing Oblivion subsequently approaching me to tell me how great this new game Skyrim was. Well, yeah, no shit. Welcome to the party, nerd. What? Nothing. Bethesda had somehow managed to hit the sweet spot, producing a game that appealed to both casuals and hardcore RPG fans alike. Through Skyrim, they had successfully made the RPG genre more accessible, but without removing the ability for long-time fans to go beyond the basics and lose themselves in the many RPG systems that the game has to offer. And of course, once these people were exposed to the Skyrim experience, they realised that there's really nothing else quite like it, aside from the previous games in the Elder Scrolls series, of course. And while many will attribute the game's unprecedented longevity to the incredibly active and competent modding community, I think it's equally due to the fact that the Skyrim experience simply hasn't been replicated in any meaningful way since. There's an itch that only Skyrim can scratch for a large number of players. Honestly, I myself barely touch mods, and I've replayed the game more times than I'd care to admit. It's actually the only game that I have 100% achievements for, and I'm not even a completionist in general. But anyway, let's step out of the background and talk about why people like me just can't seem to put this game down. Or, at least, not for long. And let's start, as I like to do in these reviews, with the early experience in the game. Those make or break initial minutes and hours that typically answer that famous question once asked by 1970s rock band The Clash. Should I stay or should I go? Okay, I really need to have a word with myself about some of my jokes. Of course, the very first moments in Skyrim are at this point so iconic that they're instantly recognisable even to many people who haven't even played the game. Most people who have accessed the internet for more than using Facebook to complain about millennials consuming avocado toast will probably be familiar with those famous words that have featured in memes innumerable.
Hey, you. Finally awake.
Honestly, my friend even bought me a mug sporting those words once upon a time, though it was sadly destroyed in the dishwasher. Sorry, Kevin. But on a more serious note, I think this opening sequence actually does an incredible job of setting the tone for the entire game. It gives the player this sense of impending doom as the cart slowly winds its way through this bleak and unforgiving environment to the site of your untimely demise. The writing quite cleverly adds a real feeling of authenticity to the moment by bringing out the various emotions of your fellow passengers. Ralof sits calmly and reminisces, as people often do when they know the end is approaching. In his case, about a girl he was once enamoured with from the very town he's about to be executed in. While Lokia, the petty thief in way above his head, gradually comes to realise his fate as the journey progresses, and his panicked reaction serves as the perfect contrast to Ralof's calm acceptance. Then, of course, you have the third passenger, Ulfric Stormcloak, self-proclaimed High King of Skyrim, whose neutral demeanour and inability to speak due to being gagged adds a sense of mystery and suspense to this brief initial journey. It leaves you with questions, itches you want to scratch. How exactly did this unlikely company end up together in the back of this cart, all condemned to the same grim fate? Then that feeling of impending doom accelerates as you arrive in the town of Helgen and are coldly and methodically processed, slowly shuffling your way to the executioner's block to die for an undetermined crime in this snow-swept settlement far from home. The whole scene just builds a sense of finality and dread, and of an oppressive regime willing to execute a man for the crime of stealing a horse, or, even in the player's case, due to what appears to be a clerical mistake. And then, as your fate is seemingly sealed, the story totally changes direction in the most unlikely of ways, with a dragon attack taking you from one near-death situation straight into another. But this one isn't a slow, methodical plod to your grave, it's a heart-racing pursuit through a town being incinerated by dragonfire, with you jumping between buildings as their walls come toppling down around you. It's an incredibly well thought out opening sequence, and it introduces two key plots in the most high stakes way, with each of them having almost cost you your life in the very first moments of the game. These are of course the main story involving the dragon Alduin, and the civil war between the Imperials and the Stormcloaks. Though I won't give any more details on how those stories unfold, as I try to avoid major spoilers even when reviewing older RPGs. What I will say, or repeat even, is that you're left with a lot of questions after this opening sequence, and you already have significant incentive to find out more about this cold and mysterious province of Skyrim. Of course, these early moments in the game offer a lot more than just setting up the story. During this initial sequence, you also get your first taste of the world itself, and the graphical and audible experience that bring it to life. The cold and bleak landscape of this initial zone certainly gives the sense of a harsh and unforgiving environment, and of a challenging existence for its inhabitants. But there's also beauty to it. The soft mist, the snow-coated pines, the sunlight illuminating the forest as you turn the final corner to Helgen. It all comes together to form a mesmerising introduction to the game's most iconic biome. Then you have the people around you, who, while not graphically impressive by today's standards, do fit in seamlessly with the gritty realism of their surroundings. They just look like a people hardened by their environment, and add to that overall feeling of immersion. And of course it would be criminal of me not to mention the music. That epic main theme that you're first treated to in the main menu is burned into my memory forever. But Skyrim's musical offering goes far beyond that, with the game consistently and masterfully matching the audible experience to the visual look and feel of the game's different environments. Honestly, I still crap myself when I'm walking through a peaceful forest, taking in the ambient sounds and mystical music, only for the combat music to suddenly kick in, signalling that I'm to be imminently eviscerated by a bear. Anyway, before I get too carried away, there are still a few more key areas that I want to address as part of the early experience in the game. The first of which is character creation, which is pretty, what can I say, standard in Skyrim. There are a decent number of customization options, and you can produce a reasonably good looking character with relative ease. I am, however, afraid to inform those of you who have played Oblivion that Skyrim's character creation system really dials in your ability to create overly exaggerated facial features. Apparently something to do with some of the player-created characters that people made in the previous game. Anyway, character creation in Skyrim isn't going to set the world on fire, but what you can produce is perfectly acceptable given the technical limitations of the time, and it hasn't aged too badly in my opinion. Also, you have to remember that the vast majority of people will be playing in first person, because quite frankly, that's how the game's designed to be played. Therefore, you rarely ever see your own character anyway, so it's not massively relevant. What is probably more interesting and relevant with regards to character creation is the option to pick your race. And while the impact of your race is somewhat diminished compared to previous games in the series, it still has a tangible impact on your gameplay, with racial abilities ranging from actually quite overpowered, such as the Breton's 25% resistance to all magical damage and powerful magic absorption ability, to totally useless, such as the Wood Elf's ability to turn an animal into an ally for 60 seconds once per day, which is incredibly situational, and you're probably just going to forget that you even have it. Each race is also granted a boost to certain skills, which can be helpful if you know the type of build that you want to go for and you want to get a head start on the relevant skills that will complement that build. Though it's important to note that any character can in fact level any skill, so picking a race based on these skill bonuses is only really going to offer a benefit in the very early game. Overall, the race you pick won't make or break your experience in the game, but the options available do add a nice bit of extra flavour, and the racial bonuses offered certainly have significance when it comes to playing the game at higher difficulty settings. You may also notice at this point that you don't pick a class, as would be the case in many games of a similar nature, including previous Elder Scrolls games in fact, and this is because Skyrim features an entirely classless system, and we'll get into a lot more detail on how all of that works later in the video. Anyway, once you've created your character and navigated the freshly created hellscape that was once Helgen, you'll need to wind your way through some dark and claustrophobic tunnels and caves in which you're going to get your first taste of combat. And as is the case with all Elder Scrolls games, it's probably not going to blow your mind. Certainly not in these very early stages at least. It gets better and better in my opinion, and I'll explain why when we move into the core experience of the game. However, in these early stages, you're introduced to a basic action combat system that involves melee attacks with a variety of one- and two-handed weapons, ranged attacks with bows and eventually crossbows if you have the Dawnguard DLC, the ability to block, cast spells, use items such as potions, and perform stealth attacks to gain a critical strike modifier. It's a simple system overall, and it doesn't deviate significantly from the combat systems of the previous games in the series. The main issue that you'll likely hear about when it comes to combat in Skyrim is the fact that swinging a melee weapon feels as if you're waving around a pool noodle and never really connecting with anything. Floaty is probably the best word to describe it, and as much as I love this game, it does feel like absolute garbage after having played a game like Elden Ring, where you feel the impact of every connection in a deeply satisfying way. It's a shame, as it's always really lessened my enjoyment of melee builds. However, it's never been a deal breaker for me, and other forms of combat can feel far more satisfying in my opinion. In particular, the ever popular stealth archer build, but also some of the particularly creative magic builds available. Anyway, we'll get back to combat in more detail later in the video. The final thing I want to talk about when it comes to the game's early experience is a realization that new players will likely have, especially if they haven't played an Elder Scrolls game before. And that's the realization of just how incredibly interactive this world really is. The very fact that you can interact with so many objects in the game world just gives a sense of realism that sets Skyrim apart from other games. There's just something innately satisfying about looting an actual physically present item and seeing it disappear, rather than just picking up randomly generated items from a loot window. But it goes beyond just looting these items. It's watching them scatter across the floor after being caught by a stray arrow, or even just slinging them around the room yourself, because why the hell not? In my opinion, this level of interactivity just deepens your connection to the world by adding that additional layer of physical interaction, a seemingly simple thing that very few games offer even to this day. This feeling isn't accomplished solely through the manipulation of physical items either. It's the ability to engage in a wide range of activities that compound that feeling of an interactive environment, many of which we'll talk about later in the video. But another example you come across early on is the option to physically pick locks to access restricted areas or chests, or the ability to read every single one of the various books dotted around the place, sometimes receiving a skill point for your trouble, but at the very least giving you an interesting snippet of lore that further builds on this world's deep and rich history. It's classic Bethesda when they're at their best. They bring all of these seemingly insignificant little details together to create something that far exceeds the sum of its parts, and that's because of the connection to the world that they make you feel. Anyway, once you've wound your way through Helgen's tunnels, caved in a sufficient number of skulls, and carefully navigated your way around a sleeping bear, You'll eventually emerge from the cocoon of the game's tutorial into the open world as a majestic butterfly, or more realistically as a level 1 pleb with a handful of items that you manage to scavenge along the way. And this is really where the core experience of the game begins. And what I mean by core experience in these reviews is basically how the game's going to play for the vast majority of the hours you spend in it. You know, once the shiny veneer of the carefully curated opening sequence rubs off. And as is typical with Elder Scrolls games, this symbolic movement from early to core experience happens relatively early on. Elder Scrolls games don't tend to hold your hand for long. They run you through a story-driven tutorial with diverse themes such as being a prisoner and that one game in the series where you didn't actually start off being a prisoner. And then they unceremoniously toss you out into the open world, and the next move is yours. And that's the beauty of these games. Almost from the very beginning, you're offered total freedom over what to do. It's your adventure. From this moment on, you really can just walk in any direction you like. You could follow the main quest path down to Riverwood, or you could turn in the total opposite direction and wind your way through the mountain pass until you reach pretty much anything that takes your interest. It could be a cavern in the mountainside to explore, a town, an interesting looking NPC. You might kick off a quest to recover a Daedric artifact, or stumble upon a dungeon, offering riches to those with the fortitude to venture into its depths. Or you might just be set upon by bandits in a random encounter. Skyrim is teeming with content to engage in, and wherever you go, you'll almost certainly stumble upon something. Though, be warned, it's not always something that you're going to be able to handle immediately, which certainly adds to the sense of danger in the world. Level scaling is a thing in Skyrim, but it's not applied consistently, and it's the sort of thing that you're going to realise pretty quickly when you stumble upon a giant camp in the early game, or get caught with your pants down by a dragon attack. However, despite this freedom of choice that I've just described, during your first playthrough I would definitely suggest that it's worth at least following the initial step of the main quest. For one, this will take you past the standing stones, from which you can receive a powerful permanent blessing for your desired build, and secondly, by taking this route you're treated to some pretty incredible visuals as you make your descent into the town of Riverwood. Your path weaves through a tranquil pine forest, surrounded in the distance by Skyrim's iconic mist-veiled peaks. And speaking of those peaks, there's something really quite enticing about the verticality in this game in general. When you see a mountain, you tend to wonder whether there might be a reason to climb it. For example, as you journey to Riverwood in this very early stage of the game, you'll likely notice the ancient ruins high up on the other side of the valley, and your mind is set to wondering what type of adventure they might have to offer you. And you'll find out soon enough. Now, while we're on the subject of snow-capped mountains, I do want to add that despite the fairly prevalent opinion that Skyrim is a little homogenous in terms of its biomes, I think that's actually doing the game a bit of a disservice. I'll definitely agree that there's an overall bleak atmosphere to pretty much all of the biomes, and that the architectural diversity in all of the major cities is somewhat lacking. However, when you consider the forests, the mountains, the swamps, the dwarven ruins, the dark and dingy goblin caves, the vast underground zone of Blackreach, the alien-like island of Solstheim, and the nightmarish domain of Hermaeus Mora, it's fair to say that Skyrim is in fact much more than snow-covered mountains and frosty tundra. Not that that wintry overworld even disappoints in the first place. It's incredibly atmospheric, and on top of the beautiful panoramic views that you encounter at every turn, you're also treated to diverse weather effects that include everything from bright blue skies to snowstorms to stunning auroras at night. Now, we've talked a lot about the world itself, but what about the world's inhabitants? Well, aesthetically, they generally fit their setting pretty well, as I mentioned earlier. They have what I'd describe as a look of rugged realism, mixed with some elements of high fantasy, depending on the race. Graphically, they are very much of their time, and they feature low-resolution textures by modern standards, as well as very limited facial expressions that do lead to them looking awkwardly deadpan in pretty much every conversation, regardless of the topic. But then again, they are a far cry from the absolute abominations of Oblivion, and that's coming from a die-hard Oblivion fan. The main improvement is that they actually look believable, and don't instantly break your immersion from the otherwise beautifully designed fantasy setting by looking like a boiled potato that's been overly shaken in the colander. But it's not all about looks, and what really matters when it comes to Skyrim's NPCs, of course, is their personalities, which primarily manifest themselves through the dialogue and voice acting. Unfortunately, I wouldn't describe either of these things as Skyrim's strong suit, if I'm honest. The writing itself is fairly uninspired for the most part. I'd describe it as very functional. It feels like it's there to serve the purpose of providing information to the player and not much more. And I've always felt it lacks the depth or personality seen in other RPGs like The Witcher 3 for example. The sort of exception being the main quest, and to an extent the guild quest lines and DLCs. But I still wouldn't go expecting fireworks in this department. Part of this is probably due to the relatively limited cast of voice actors compared to the number of NPCs in the game, which is fair enough given the enormous number of NPCs, but you do start to notice when one person is voicing 20 of them. And while the voice acting itself is pretty solid, it's often delivered in a way that lacks emotional depth, which if you think about it kind of makes sense when someone's having to play 20 different parts, probably back to back in the recording studio in many cases. It also explains why the main story feels more compelling from this perspective, as generally the NPCs involved in the main story have a single dedicated voice actor. Of course, these limitations didn't stop them coming out with some of the most iconic phrases in gaming.
I used to be an adventurer like you. Then I took an arrow in the knee.
And we will of course be eternally thankful for the endless meme potential provided. What does set Skyrim's NPCs apart from other games, however, isn't the way they look, or even the way in which they interact with you. It's how they interact with each other and the world around them. Bethesda's Radiant AI system gives them daily routines, where they'll carry out chores, visit certain locations, and stop for little chats with other NPCs. And while all of this sounds very basic, which I suppose it is by today's standards, it really does make Skyrim feel like a living and breathing world, in a way that I would argue hasn't been well replicated in many games since. Every NPC just has that element of intrigue. No one's truly generic because everyone has a routine, something to say, some role to play, however basic it might be. Just as in real life, I suppose, and perhaps that's part of the appeal. Some of them own a business, some of them will fight beside you as your companion, some of them you can even marry and others you just pass in the street, or perhaps randomly murder because you suspect that they are in fact the one who stole your sweet roll. So even though the NPCs themselves don't offer a great deal of individual depth, the broad variety of roles they occupy and functions that they can perform offer a different kind of depth, and one that I think gives a more believable sense of the world being inhabited by a real population, rather than just a few very well written characters among a sea of copy and paste zombies. But enough about the other inhabitants of Skyrim. What about the most important inhabitant of all? Your own character. Well, let's talk a little about how your story might progress, and about some of the core systems that you'll be engaging in before we bring this video to a close. Well, the player character is a relative nobody at the start of the game. You don't really have a backstory aside from the fact that you've clearly made some poor decisions to end up on the back of a prison wagon facing your imminent execution. And this provides you with something of a blank canvas, which is something I really appreciate in an RPG, as it allows you to more meaningfully engage with the R and the P. It gives you the opportunity to define your own personality and write your own story to some extent. And if you just set off in any random direction after Helgen, this feeling is largely preserved. However, it does end rather abruptly if you choose to progress the main story, as very early on you learn that you are in fact much more than a nobody. And not just in the sense of your destiny, but by virtue of basically being a demigod dragonborn. Which does make for a very compelling story, but it also loses something in terms of that wholesome RPG feeling of working your way through the ranks from zero to hero, rather than being told that you are in fact a hero of legend before your legend has even really begun. It's actually one of the things that I prefer about Oblivion, which by the way I've also reviewed, and I'll put a link to that video in the description down below. Now, as I said, I won't spoil the main story for you, but despite my previous comments about it railroading your story somewhat, it's definitely worth pursuing. It involves some of the more epic encounters in the game, and it represents the thematic heart of the game in terms of it being a Nordic dragon stomping adventure. However, I will caveat this by saying that I don't believe it to be the game's best content, not by a long shot. Which isn't particularly surprising, as Elder Scrolls games are typically more famous for their side content than their main stories, in particular the guild storylines, which admittedly vary in their quality across each of the Elder Scrolls games, but in my opinion are at the heart of giving the sense of a world in which there are many meaningful and interesting paths that you can follow. Be that as a thief operating out of the Rift and Ratways, a mage of the College of Winterhold, or perhaps most famously of all, an assassin of the secretive Dark Brotherhood. Now, in my opinion, the best guild experience by far is indeed the Dark Brotherhood, but the Thieves Guild and the Companions also offer compelling storylines with some enjoyable twists and turns, as well as offering you powerful rewards, and even unlocking entirely new features such as the ability to become a werewolf, for example. The College of Winterhold I do find a little lackluster if I'm honest, which is kind of my take on the Oblivion equivalent as well, but at least in Oblivion it unlocked the incredibly enjoyable spellmaking feature, whereas in Skyrim it just feels like a generic questline without any real connection to magic. You can basically just hack and slash your way through it without ever casting a single spell. Side content, however, goes far beyond just guild storylines. You also have the whole Civil War storyline, in which you pick a side and support them across the various battles and sieges in order to help them claim ownership of the province, which is actually one of the few quest lines that involve some moderately meaningful player choices that actually do have a level of impact on the story outcome and the world in general. And then of course you have the huge volume of random quest lines that range from joining in on a family feud, to solving a mysterious murder, to hunting down Daedric artifacts on behalf of their namesakes. And of course you don't even need to get involved in a quest to find something to do in Skyrim. You could just delve a random dungeon you come across and see what loot or lore it might throw up. Though I will warn you that Skyrim's dungeons do get kind of repetitive after a while. You could also just stay in town and work on your alchemy or smithing. You could invest in one of the local stores, find yourself someone to marry or a child to adopt. You could buy or even build a player house. Or just go and chop wood for basically minimum wage. Seriously, you can actually do that in the game. And of course that's just the content in the base game. You also have the game's 2 DLC storylines, Dragonborn and Dawnguard, both of which in my opinion have a better storyline than the main quest. And they also add some really fun features to the game in general, such as the ability to become a vampire lord or unlock a new weapon type with the crossbow. There's just a massive amount of content to engage in, and you can easily spend 100 hours in Skyrim without even seeing half of what the game has to offer. One criticism I do have that applies to pretty much all story-driven content in the game, however, is that there's very minimal meaningful player choice involved. And the small number of choices you actually do get to make don't really have much of an impact on the story outcome or the world itself. And I get why to an extent, it's because of the huge volume of content that we've just discussed. Skyrim just has so many threads that trying to apply the impact of complex player choices to each of them in a way that offers an overall consistent experience would be incredibly difficult. But it does feel like a bit of a shame, especially given that early games in the series were able to accomplish this to some extent. And it's one of the things I'd like to see return for Elder Scrolls 6. That's not to say that player choice isn't present, it's just a very different kind of player choice in Skyrim. For example, in a game like Dragon Age Origins, which I'm actually currently playing and will put a review out for fairly soon, you're on a fairly linear overall path in terms of the content you can engage with. But the impact of your choices on that path are massively significant, and have a very real impact on the story outcome at various stages as well as the people around you. Whereas in Skyrim, all of the stories are pretty much on rails. But what you do get is a massive amount of choice when it comes to deciding which rail to ride. And this is due to the sheer volume of fully fleshed out and worthwhile storylines that you're able to pursue in the game's massive open world. Now, if a game can take the strengths of both Skyrim and Dragon Age Origins in that regard, well, let's just say this could quickly become a single game channel for a while. So we've talked a great deal about the world itself, the various storylines to engage in, and the massive amount of player agency offered in how you go about your journey. Now let's move on to some of the key systems that you're going to interact with. And let's start with combat, which we began to touch on during the early observations section of the video. And the comment I made was, it gets better. Now, why do I think that is? Well, what Skyrim lacks in terms of polished and fast-paced action combat, it makes up for in the sheer breadth of the combat styles and tactical variety available to you. Yes, melee combat in Skyrim is a pretty lackluster experience that mostly consists of spamming light and heavy attacks that barely feel as if they're connecting. However, I will make the same observation that I did in my Oblivion review, and that is that the joy in Skyrim combat comes more from the alternative combat approaches that the game's very flexible system enables. You can be a mage who's clad in plate armour and wields a two-handed axe if you really want to. You could be a stealthy thief who specialises in alteration magic, or a bow-wielding, demon-conjuring alchemist. Basically, you can make any combination you want. And this is because any character can level any skill simply by using that skill. You're not locked into anything at all in Skyrim. Sure, you have to invest time in leveling each skill, but you can change course at any time you want, providing you're willing to spend some time leveling a different set of skills instead. Basically, the system works like this. There are 18 different skill trees in the game, broadly grouped into warrior, mage, and thief oriented skills. You can level any one of these skills by simply using it. For example, hitting an enemy with a one-handed sword will give you experience towards your one-handed skill, and casting a destruction spell will give you experience towards your destruction skill, and so on. Each time you level up a skill, that will contribute a small amount of experience towards leveling up your character as a whole. Typically, the majority of your experience each level is going to come from your most heavily used combat skills. For example, if you're a stealth archer, then most of your experience is probably going to come from your archery and sneak skills. When your character gains a level, you'll be able to increase one of your 3 main attributes, health, stamina or magicka, by a small amount, and you'll be given a perk point to spend in one of the perk trees that are attached to each of the 18 skills. And these perk trees basically provide you with passive and active abilities that will improve said skill. And like I said, you're never locked into using any particular skills, and you can start leveling a new skill at any time you like. It's one of the real strengths of the game, and to be honest, all Elder Scrolls games. And it allows you to be very creative with combat. Because even though, well, on the face of it, Skyrim combat looks very simplistic, it actually offers a great deal of depth in terms of the combat styles available to you. And that's before you even start to consider the wide range of interesting weapons and dragon shouts, for example, that you can weave in. Something I do feel lets Skyrim's combat down, however, is lack of enemy variety, specifically when it comes to the movesets and tactics deployed by the enemies you encounter throughout the game. The reality is that outside of, well, dragons really, the majority of enemies in the game share a very limited set of mechanics. Even dragons, who have more unique mechanics, mostly due to their ability to fly, simply repeat the same sequence over and over, regardless of the level or type of dragon you're facing. It's also another part of the reason why dungeons feel so repetitive, as it's rare to come across a boss fight that feels substantially different to pretty much any other fight in the game. Ultimately, difficulty in Skyrim, as with its predecessor, is primarily dictated by the amount of health and damage allocated to that particular enemy based on the difficulty setting that you've selected, rather than offering a mechanical challenge in the way that Elden Ring does, for example. But I really don't want to sell the game short here, as there are a vast number of fun and interesting tactics that you can deploy in order to survive those higher difficulty settings. It's just a very different type of challenge that focuses more on the preparation for a fight rather than the fight itself, which actually is an immensely satisfying component of the more traditional RPG, before everything became so action-oriented. So that covers combat and character progression. There are of course many other minor systems in the game, such as the non-combat skills of alchemy, smithing and enchanting, the ability to cook food, marry, buy houses, adopt children, become a vampire or a werewolf, but to go into each of them in detail probably doesn't add much for the purpose of this video. And by the way, I have detailed guides on pretty much all of them on my channel anyway. But what I will say is that the volume of systems for you to engage in, even after you accept that some of them aren't particularly exciting, does in itself make Skyrim feel like a game of incredible breadth and discovery. You're forever stumbling upon something new. For example, contracting the vampiric disease during a random fight, and then realising that you're actually gradually transitioning into a vampire, which in itself brings a whole new set of advantages and disadvantages. And how that's not even a significant feature of the game, it's just something you stumble upon, as you do with many of Skyrim's features and systems. And there's really something quite special about going through that process of discovery, rather than having it rammed down your throat in a more linear gaming experience. Speaking of which, the final thing worth mentioning before we move to our conclusion is modding, a topic that I've deliberately avoided in this review. Why is that? Well, because modding in Skyrim is so incredibly powerful that it can turn Skyrim into pretty much a completely different game, or multiple completely different games. Which means that to cover modding in detail, you would effectively have to review all of the many outcomes that modding the game can provide. However, what I will say about modding is that it takes a game that's already immensely replayable and pours rocket fuel on that replayability. And for that reason, it has kept countless numbers of players engaged in Skyrim for far longer than they otherwise would have been. And this is due to these mods allowing players to experience totally fresh and immersive experiences, but experiences that have been built on the undeniably solid foundations of a game that they know and love. So, what's the verdict? Well, I suspect that you've already guessed that I think Skyrim is absolutely, without any shadow of a doubt, still worth playing. It's considered one of the best RPGs of all time for a reason. Yes, it has its weaknesses with its dated graphics, its uninspired melee combat and limited enemy tactics, just to name a few. However, when you weigh those weaknesses up against the incredible journey of exploration and adventure that this game offers, across a diverse, stunning and interactive world with more interesting and unique content than you can consume in 100 hours, well, the weaknesses of the game really do start to feel quite insignificant in comparison. Skyrim just has a formula that works. It's the refinement of the Elder Scrolls formula that once you've experienced, you never really forget. It kind of becomes part of you, and every so often you'll get an itch that no other game is really able to scratch. And before you know it, you find yourself heading back into Helgen to start yet another playthrough. And to me, that's because Skyrim is more than the sum of its parts. It's a game with a soul, something that's actually very difficult to articulate, because in many ways it's not about the interconnected system of features that you experience, it's about something you feel. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider subscribing and clicking the bell notification. I'll be putting out many more RPG reviews in the future, with Dragon Age Origins and The Witcher 3 being next on my list. But either way, thanks for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.